Congratulations on reading Heart of Darkness. It's a very challenging story with long paragraphs, complicated sentence structure, lots of stylistic extravagance. It's also a challenging subject to read about. It's set in Africa at the end of the 19th century in the Belgian Congo. This part of Africa was held as a proprietary possession by King Leopold of Belgium. He was intent on extracting as much wealth as he could from this possession, and he was not interested at all in the people who already lived there. His efforts were focused on using the resources to enrich himself. And this is going to form one of the themes that we read about in the story. Casual racism is taken for granted in the context of this story. Our author has a very clear idea that European civilization is the pinnacle of civilization at that time, and you'll find Africans called savages several times throughout the story, and you'll find the N-word used as well. What I want you to be aware of is just that this is part of the historical context. In this story, the focus is not on examining the question of racism. It's just part of what's in the story. And there will be an opportunity for you to focus on specific passages and see what meaning you'd like to draw out of the regard that our narrator, Marlowe, has for the natives. But first of all, I want to make sure that everybody understands what's happening in the story. The first thing to notice is that this story has a frame. And in the frame story, you've got 5 Englishmen sitting on the deck of a yacht at the mouth of an English river, the River Thames. It's spelled T-H-A-M-E-S. Looks like it should rhyme with James, but it is pronounced Thames. And in this frame story, we've got a narrator who is the first-person narrator, first-person point of view. The central story that the frame is enclosing is narrated by Marlowe, who is one of the 5 men that's sitting on the yacht. He's not the I of the frame story. So at the beginning, page 186 through 190, kind of back and forth between this unnamed first-person narrator of the frame, and when Marlowe is the narrator, you'll see paragraphs, for instance, on page 190, beginning with quotation marks. That's because Marlowe is narrating. Now, when you have the same narrator from paragraph to paragraph, you don't need to close quotes at the end of the paragraph, so you see at the end of each of these paragraphs on page 190, there is no close quote. It just begins again with a quotation marks at the beginning of the next paragraph to remind you that Marlowe is still speaking. You have quotes within quotes. For instance, look at page 208. Marlowe is narrating. At the middle of the page, I slapped him on the back and shouted, "We shall have rivets!" He scrambled to his feet, exclaiming, "No! Rivets?" as if he couldn't believe his ears. I don't know why we behave like lunatics, Marlowe says. And you see the single quotes like apostrophes enclosing the quote within the quote, where Marlowe is quoting himself or quoting someone else within his narration. So the frame, the point of view, that part is the narrative method. Another aspect of the narrative method is that Marlowe doesn't just stick to chronology. So on page 191, he is explaining how he was trying to get a job captaining a steamboat in Africa. And as part of this explanation, he jumps right out of where he is in the story over to Africa and explains what happened to the steamboat captain that he's going to replace. And then he jumps forward in the narration to the time when he was in Africa himself and went to the place where Freysleben, the previous captain, has been lying dead, rotting on the ground until he gets there. So you'll notice a lot of these instances where Marlowe tends to jump around when he's telling the story. But Marlowe is traveling down the coast of Africa, then he transfers into a steamboat to go up the Congo River to where he's supposed to relieve this ivory trader, an agent for the company, who has been laid up sick and needs to send his ivory back and needs to come back himself to get medical help. Okay, so let's just make sure you understand what happened in today's reading assignment. You've got 5 old friends sitting quietly at sunset on this sailboat where the Thames meets the ocean. The narrator thinks about how many British heroes have traveled the ocean from the Thames, from right where they are on famous English ships. And Marlowe is thinking something different. He's thinking about how the mouth of the Thames and the Thames River in England used to be one of the dark places of the earth. So he's thinking about the young Roman citizens coming when the Roman Empire was still expanding, and he's thinking about how it seemed to them to be out in the jungle, the heart of darkness, what is now a very civilized place, England. He tells his friends a story about his own journey to the heart of darkness, to Africa, to the Belgian Congo late in the 19th century. Marlowe's aunt is a very idealistic person, thinks that the colonizers are bringing light to those ignorant millions in Africa, and she pulls some strings to get him this job he wants as a steamboat captain for a company that's extracting ivory from the Africans. Marlowe's aunt makes him sound like he's a very intelligent and idealistic young man, whereas Marlowe just is going there for the job and for the adventure rather than to bring light to the ignorant millions. He goes down the coast of Africa, and it feels very isolating to him. It all seems very unreal when he sees the European pretensions at colonial domination. And at the company's station, he sees some of the horrors that were actually happening. Africans were enslaved, summarily executed, worked to exhaustion, and then left to die. And this is some of what he sees there. The company's accountant, who maintains European standards of dressing for work, mentions Mr. Kurtz, this very important agent who works at the central station, and he tells Marlowe that Mr. Kurtz is a very remarkable person who will be in company administration soon, and that's on page 199. Now, the next stage of Marlowe's journey is a 200-mile tramp overland, which he talks about on page 200. He says that the climate and the challenges of his experience may make him scientifically interesting to that doctor who, back on page 193, measured his head and said that it would be interesting to look at the mental changes that happen on the spot in Africa. So he saw at the coastal station the Africans being overworked and enslaved, and at the central station his focus is mainly on the Europeans. He learns that the steamer that he's supposed to take charge of has been wrecked and needs repairs. The manager and the other Europeans there who want to be agents, like Mr. Kurtz, regard Marlowe and Kurtz as part of a gang of virtue that idealizes this colonial enterprise as a way to share light and civilization with the Africans. And these people are just there to extract wealth from their jobs and from Africa. So they are disapproving and jealous of Marlowe. Marlowe finds the unknown wilderness so mysterious and the manager and his agents so morally repulsive that he begins to feel loyalty to Kurtz despite not having ever met him. And he uses his supposed European influence to try to get the rivets that he needs for his repair work. And that brings us to where we are for this particular lesson, Roman numeral 1, section 1 of the story. I've already talked some about the casual racism that Conrad is writing with and that Marlowe is representing, but I need to note the distinction that Marlowe draws between the Roman conquest of Britain and his own pride in what he thinks of as the English colonial effort in Africa and elsewhere. So if you look at page 189, you'll see what he thinks of what the Romans did a couple millennia ago in Britain. In the middle of the page, they were conquerors, the Romans, and for that you only want brute force, nothing to boast of when you have it, since your strength is just an accident arising from the weakness of others. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a great scale, and men going at it blind. So he says the conquest of the earth is just brute force, just robbing from other people. And he notes another group that in his own time is essentially guilty of the same thing. So look at page 209. This devoted band, and he's being ironic here, called itself the El Dorado Exploring Expedition, and I believe they were sworn to secrecy. Their talk, however, was the talk of sordid buccaneers. We'd think of them as gangsters. It was reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, and cruel without courage. So a string of words. First item in the pair has only negative connotations. The second one might shade toward positive connotations. So if you were cruel but you were also courageous, we might find something to admire about you. But if you were cruel without courage, we would essentially think of you as irredeemable. To tear treasure out of the bowels of the land was their desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe. The Romans conquering Britain just because they're strong enough to possess the whole known world, and you've got the El Dorado Exploring Expedition to just rob the natives of Africa because they have guns and the natives don't. Marlowe and the other people on the yacht want to think of the English as being in a different class from this group, and so on page 192 he suggests, as he looks at the map, about 9 or 10 lines down, large shining map, a vast amount of red. Those are the English colonies of Africa. Good to see at any time because one knows that some real work is done in there. He's thinking of some of these other European powers as laying waste to the country just for the sake of enriching themselves, but he thinks of real work happening in the English colonies. And of course, on page 197, we see that he's entirely horrified by what the Belgian colonial effort is doing to the Africans. In the middle of this page, he reflects on what he's going to be sharing with us when he sees the corruption that can arise when you have this sense that you have a superior level of civilization which you are going to share with the ignorant millions. On page 197, about a third of the way down, Marlowe says, "I've seen the devil of violence and the devil of greed and the devil of hot desire, but by all the stars those were strong, lusty, red-eyed devils that swayed and drove men, I tell you. But as I stood on this hillside, I foresaw that in the blinding sunshine of that land, I would become acquainted with a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil of a rapacious and pitiless folly." So rapacious is greedy and pitiless without pity. But a flabby, pretending, weak-eyed devil, you'll see what he's talking about when you go on farther. It's greedy eagerness for other people's property that is pretending that it's bringing something better. So I just want to notice with you a little bit about his style. Every once in a while he alludes to something that he knows that his friends will recognize the reference to. So at the bottom of page 192, when he passes through those ladies who are knitting, he references the gladiators entering the Colosseum. Morituri te salutant. Those who are about to die salute you. So the gladiators would greet the emperor as they go in ready to fight to the death. On page 203, where he is making fun of the agent who's responsible for brickmaking at the central station, he alludes to a story about the Israelites in Egypt, where they're enslaved. They have to make bricks for all these Egyptian building projects, and when Pharaoh wants to punish them, he says that they have to gather the straw as well as make the bricks. At the bottom of the page, the making of bricks. He could not make bricks without something, I don't know what, straw, maybe. So he's making fun of the fact that he's not making bricks because he doesn't have what he needs. And why doesn't he have it? Well, he's just there waiting for it. Maybe he's waiting for, a couple more lines down, an act of special creation, perhaps. So Marlowe is very scornful. He is very ironic. He has a sardonic tone to the way he describes these Europeans. He isn't seriously suggesting that this agent is expecting God to create straw out of nothing like he created the world out of nothing. The reference to special creation, but that's just his offhand, ironic way of being scornful of this character. Again, when he's talking about Freysleben, the former captain of the steamboat, he refers to the noble cause. When an opportunity offered at last to meet my predecessor, the grass growing through his ribs. Not that he was meeting his predecessor. This is his ironic way of talking about encountering his skeleton. And when he refers to the noble enterprise, that the company is engaged in. Of course, he doesn't mean it seriously. He finds it very greedy and exploitative rather than noble. Okay, so forge ahead. I know that it's difficult, but I hope it's more enjoyable now that you understand some of the tone, some of the themes, some of the background.